What is the worst thing that can happen at a tea party? You may accidentally break a cup or two, or your aunt may hear your bad comments on small sandwiches she had made. You wouldn't expect it to lead to one of the most crucial wars in the course of history. Well, this is America, and even tea parties cannot simply take place without some action. Let's go back to the second half of the 18th century. In Northern America, there were several colonies under the control of the Kingdom of England. The Brits had recently won a series of fights and wars against the French and now had a firmer grip, especially on Northeast America. The colonies were a good resource of income for the British Empire. Plus, they were seen as colonial subjects by the government, so no one bothered giving them any seats at the parliament. It is not so strange that Thomas Paine, the Englishman who supported the colonies' cause for liberty, called his address to his own nation common sense. The situation in the colonies was in fact ridiculous. The British ruled over the American colonies through governors who were born in America. Most people and a considerable amount of colonial governors had never been to England once in their whole lives. They had to work and pay taxes for a kingdom which they had never seen. Plus, they had to keep their mouths shut about all the perks given to British entities like the East India Trade Company. The whole thing was getting on people's nerves. It was all getting purely illogical. The fact that they didn't get to pick those who would represent them in England made things even worse. Taxation without representation. That was the concept that eventually pushed the colonies to the limits of their patience. The British Empire had just gotten out of the 7 Years' War and tried to get back on its feet by implementing new taxes and acts. These economic measures put an enormous strain on the economic stability of American colonies. The constant inflow of legislations and acts which protected the kingdom's interests at the expense of the colonies led to severe reactions in the colonies. The situation eventually got so severe that some British politicians took action and promoted new policies which would relieve the colonies of their pain, at least to some degree. There were many events that raised the level of tension between the kingdom and the colonies. One of the most significant being the famous Boston Tea Party. It was indeed a breaking point which just drove everything down the hill. A banking crisis which had caused severe damage to the notorious East India Trade Company pushed the British government to turn to new measures. The company was given some sort of a monopoly on tea trade in American colonies. A group called the Sons of Liberty dumped hundreds of tea crates in Boston. Infuriated by their disobedience, the British government passed the so-called Intolerable Acts, which aimed to punish the protesters. The regional congresses of the colonies gathered to come up with a solution for the crisis. The delegates wanted to ask King George to dismiss the Intolerable Acts, hoping to find a middle ground before a full-scale war broke out. However, there were those who believed in the righteousness of the protesters' actions. Skirmishes began and war broke out between the colonies and the kingdom. All hopes for a peaceful solution were lost after the kingdom declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. This made the congressmen of the colonies say to hell with it, and they thus declared a full-fledged state of independence through the most important document in the history of the United States. An essential document which promoted the idea that every human being has a God-given right to live freely in pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence was signed on 4th of July 1776 and thus began the American quest for independence. The English brought over men from the British Isles and reinforced these men with German troops who were hired to help the English fight the colonies. The colonies did not have the discipline and the arsenal of the English, but they had an advantage. Unlike the English, they depended on their own lands for supply, whereas the English had to wait for supplies and reinforcements to come all the way from Europe, which took several weeks at minimum. The Congress of the Colonies authorized George Washington as the commander of the army, which was called the Continental Army. The early weeks of the war witnessed the Continental Army seizing armaments from the Brits. The Continental Army used the cannons and weapons they stole against the Brits in an effective manner. The English showed their determination to suppress the rebellion by invading New York to use it as a base of operations. The English probably had a positive outlook for the whole situation. They probably had not assumed that a few rebellious colonies could overcome an intercontinental empire. Yet, the first year of the war proved that the Americans were determined to oppose the reinstatement of British rule. They had begun their journey towards freedom and liberty, and they would do everything until they achieved it. The initial turning point for the war was the American victory at Saratoga. The outcome of this battle proved to the world that Americans could actually win this fight. The French had almost always despised the English. They saw the American ordeal as an opportunity. They started supporting the American colonies in their fight against the English throne. The English were successful in capturing some regions like New Jersey and Delaware and holding them for a brief time. Yet, the Continental Army was now supported by the French on land and at sea. They gained the upper hand step by step and eventually pushed the British into thinking that it was a vain effort to try to control the situation. A treaty was signed. The victorious colonies gathered in Philadelphia to form and sign a constitution. The matters on which they agreed led to the establishment of the United States of America. The matters on which they couldn't agree eventually led to the Civil War of 1861. The victory of the colonies inspired other groups all around the world to pursue their desire for liberty.